line. Yes, there he is. Hi, Florian. Before Max Lesch presents a paper he's co-authoring with Lisbeth Zimmermann from Goethe University Frankfurt. Max is from the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. And then we have a paper by Mitja Sienknecht and Sasan Goliaha from Viadrina University, Frankfurt Oder, which will be presented by Sasan. And last but not least, Antje Wiener will then comment on the presentations, and I'm looking very much forward also to that as well. So is there a turning point? Maybe several turning points. Hopefully we'll know better after the discussion, and the floor is yours, Cornelia.
So is there a possibility to see the presentation? I actually...
Sure. No, it's online.
Maybe if I come there, I can see it, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead. Let me see you on. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so good evening, everyone. My name is Cornelia Baciu. I'm a researcher at the University of Copenhagen, and I'm delighted to be here in Hamburg today. And also, I'd like to extend my gratitude to the organizers of this conference for putting together such a timely discussion and debate to have on Zeitenwende and on how we respond and we should respond to the war in Ukraine. So my paper today is, and I have 10 minutes. Yeah, my paper today is on punishment. And before starting with telling you the argument and the theoretical background of this paper, I wanted first to tell you a bit of the rationale of this paper and what has bothered me to write this paper. So what has bothered me basically to write this paper is what I have perceived as a jurisdictional gap. If we think of I don't know, for example, the International Criminal Court that is not able to hold states accountable. If we think in the context of Crimea, for example, or also in other contexts, they can punish individuals, but state accountability is still, there is still a lack of jurisdiction there. And I perceive, or I see Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a turning point, perhaps similar to the fall of the Berlin Wall or the end of the Second World War. So it's that moment where, and I think Antje Wiener has also mentioned this in her introductory remarks today. I see this as really a moment where, in my paper, I would like to re-examine this idea of aggression and how punishment relates to it. Because while war is prohibited in the international legal framework, so in international law, we have the Colloquiant Pact, we have it's prohibited under UN Charter. There are several UN provisions, articles that are defining the rights to self-determination, to sovereignty, and so on. They also provide, for example, Article 2.1, they provide that collective measures should be taken in case that the state is using violence against another state. So we have these peremptory norms that have a peremptory character in international law in the sense that they are strictly binding, but and while we see a clear violation of norms that are strictly binding in international affairs, there is no elimination of danger. So we have this tension between international law as an objective mode of authority on the one side, and international law as a social practice and how it's being practiced, for example, by Russia. And this is where I basically want to look into. And this is where my paper seeks to make a contribution beyond standard explanations of international authority or gaps of international authority. I try to conceptualize this this tension between international law as an objective mode of authority and international law as a social practice. I do this by introducing conceptual framework that is juxtaposing two punitive philosophies, consequentialist philosophy and the retributivist philosophy. And I also, secondly, and my second contribution is that I introduce a distinct theoretical notion, that of imaginaries. I use Russia's invasion of Ukraine as an empirical case study. And what I forgot to mention, perhaps, is that the idea of punishment and why punishment is important is that punishment is can be seen as a mimesis of normalization of relations within the Commonwealth and between the guilty and the victim on the other side. And this is something that Nietzsche wrote, and you'll see that in my paper I engage a lot with foundational literature on punishment from Nietzsche, Foucault, Hegel, and others. And a mimesis, maybe just to briefly define, is a bird, is a mockingbird that is able to mimic and imitate the sounds of other birds or insects. Okay, so briefly to this different punitive philosophies that I'm talking about, consequentialism on the other side, on the one side, and retributivism. So punishment, as I said, is not new in the literature. There's a lot of literature on punishment, as you can see from very 19th century relational perspectives, for example, from Nietzsche. But there are also some more recent studies on punishment, for example, on international and criminal law. And I distinguish between these two penal philosophies or punitive philosophies. The consequentialist one basically argues that so these two philosophies, they correspond to Kant's two concepts of right, and they correspond also to two concepts of freedom, so positive and negative freedom. Consequentialism, on the other side, on the one side, argues that that punishment is not and the punishment of the guilty is not something that is being systematically determined, but it's something that is based on conventional foundations, and it depends on the consequences. It depends on the social costs of the punishment. So it's not an automatism there. Retributivism, on the other side, is arguing that it sees the wrongdoer as punishable. The perpetrator needs to be held accountable for her or his or its actions. And there's also a collective responsibility of the Commonwealth or of the community to hold the perpetrator accountable. So basically, my argument here is that so I use the international system, the international organization, and I include here a metaphor, that of Panopticum, that basically is aimed to describe the international organization. So I see the international organization as a practice of monitoring and accountability holding. So a Panopticum is basically a system, a monitoring mechanism in which the minimum number of observers can monitor a maximum number of watched. So of course, yeah, so the second part of, I can elaborate during the discussion on the Panopticum. So the second part of my argument is that the punishment of states is challenging on the one side because of the constitutive nature of the international system, and on the other side tensions between constituent authority and constituted authority. And I think also there I could elaborate in the Q&A session. And especially important here are the changing imaginaries of state. So these changing imaginaries are as an essentialized subjective meaning, and they emerge from mnemonical conditions and remembrances of the past. So they basically resemble a metaphysical reality in which the first order ontological conditions are not independent of the second order. So the second order is the perceptions of the first order, so are not independent of second order subjectivities. In these imaginaries, the recognition of others is important, and yeah, we could say that what I call this coexistence, or the notion of Mitsein, might temper states in their absolute expression of freedom and so on. So now to come to my empirical part, what I try to illustrate in this figure is how state imaginaries by Russia are changing, and I have from 1990s, or from the Ukraine Declaration of Sovereignty until recent time, until the war has started, I have documented different treaties and agreements that have been signed between Russia and Ukraine and other parties that are important because they try to confine, or they try to define Ukraine's sovereignty. However, most of these treaties have been now violated, and in the aftermath of the invasion, there has nonetheless been some forms of punishment, and we can distinguish between different forms of punishment. For example, there have been sanctions, there have been resolutions, there were exclusions, there were other preparatory retributive steps that I can also elaborate on during the discussion, and there were also symbolic countermeasures. So, yeah, well, I mean, in terms of contribution of my paper, I would say that one of my paper is demonstrating, and I'm also, I would be happy to share my paper with you. My paper shows that punishment and the condition of international law is different than previously understood. And in terms of future research, perhaps, yeah, there are different avenues, but perhaps central would be to understand whether there's different kinds of punishment, different punitive philosophies, whether they reveal different types of order, and whether the conception of order is about norms or is more than that. What is the difference between norms and orders? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll take care of that. And next one, so thanks again. Legal norms, I think, quite an issue in the case of Ukraine. And next one is Florian Hubert, who is joining us virtually. If you have a presentation, please share your screen. If not, then please go ahead, and I'll think about how to let you know about the timing virtually as well.
Okay. Right. Yeah, good afternoon from Frankfurt, everyone. I'm happy to be here, even if only by Zoom conference. It's a bit pity not to be able to be there in Hamburg with you, but I will try to make the best out of it anyway. Although it is a bit strange to me to speak in front of you while I see my own screen in front of you. But okay, let's start. So when I was following the developments of the Russian aggression against Ukraine in the recent month and its justifications by Russia, I was less surprised about the fact that Russia actually violates countless norms and principles of international law, because this is pretty much what we have already observed, at least since 2014 and with the annexation of Crimea, and probably even before that. I was shocked, however, about two different things, which I think the discipline of international relations and especially norm research must respond to, because it carries the potential of a more fundamental shift, a paradigm shift in European and international order, in which a relevant state group around Russia and China, for instance, not only criticize and opposing Western understandings and interpretation of international law anymore, but, however, increasingly and proactively formulates their own standards and whole new grammars of international law, and even, as it seems to be the case in the Ukraine for the first time in history, actually formulates their own formulas of legitimate force in foreign countries, in their, as they call it, near abroad. So there is something new happening, which we can observe and which we need to address in norms research. So let me briefly outline two things which, in my opinion, has fundamentally changed since or actually with the annexation of Ukraine by Russia. And then second, how that challenged the discipline of international relations and especially norms research. So what has changed actually since or with the invasion of Ukraine? So far, we have known from Russian understandings of international law that it was based on a traditional reading, which had its norm of sovereignty as the most fundamental element, and leads Russia, but also China and many other states in the world, to a very strong opposition against institutions like the responsibility to protect, for example, just because state sovereignty was the indispensable norm and left no room for justifications of humanitarian responsibility and so on. And the result of that traditional reading of international law by Russia and China and so on wasn't actually too far-reaching, as it was usually expressed only in practices by that Russia and China, for example, vetoed any attempts to initiate collective action of the international community against violations of humanitarian standards and so on. But wasn't far-reaching in terms of providing some own ideas and ordering conceptions out of that interpretations of international law. So the mode of action which we have known from Russia so far, at least what the interpretation of international law concerns, has been one of opposition and objection of Western standards, but less on one of presenting own standards and ordering performances. With the invasion of Ukraine, however, Russia reclaims norms and rules of international law, and that's unique, with justification of a special operation in Ukraine, seems to emulate institutions like the R2P in an own and dangerous way. Russia claims to have historic rights and a right to protection of, and that's an important distinction, in contrast to the responsibility to protect, for example, not so much to protect Russian people, but right to protect the dominance and influence of the Russian culture and history in its so-called near abroad. So Russia uses justifications, which is actually known from Western states, in order to proactively formulate a legitimate right to start an intervention. And this is, of course, new and breaches heavily with Russia's more traditional reading of international law and brings along very new challenges. And we can observe, I think, a shift from a paradigm from Russia opposition and critique towards a paradigm of disruption, with the proactive creation of its own interpretation and followed actions presented by Russia. And second, what has also changed is that there are indeed quite some states within the international community, such as China, but also some states from the so-called Global South, who really acknowledge these kind of justifications and reinterpretations by Russia as being legitimate international law, which has to be acknowledged. And this state group share what practical theory would call some backward knowledge and an internally coherent pattern of reasoning of what counts as international law and legitimate action. So in short, what has fundamentally changed is a unique situation in which very different state communities in international and true and world order seems to be built and formed in international politics, and each following their own rationalities and even more problematic in that case, their own perception on what is actually the case and a perception about the very situation at hand. And finally, that these state groups act more proactive than ever before. I would not say that they are acting more proactive since ever before, but certainly since a long time. And my point would be that these different perception of what makes sense for these state groups and what counts as lawful action cannot be reduced of being more cheap talk or whether build an or just what the debate would call billiges Gerede, but whether build an internally coherent pattern of reasoning which IE needs to address and learn to cope with. And my impression is here that, and I'll turn to what follows from that for norms research. My impression is here that especially the traditional norm research, which builds on the logic of arguing, appropriateness, and so on, but also more realistic contributions which build on a theory of action of consequentialism and so on, are actually based on some preconditions which it cannot present any longer, as it seems more and more challenging for the practitioners, but also then in the reconstruction for the theory of international relations, to even find a common ground for communication and cooperation under the condition of very different state communities, each following their whole own rationalities, perception of what is the situation, what's the case, and so on. And then, of course, a whole new set of challenges arise for especially norm research to engage and reconstruct these kind of each internally coherent logics and rationalities of these state groups, and to reconstruct of what action actually makes sense within these kind of state groups, and what other action we might expect from Russia and other states after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I will stop for here now and maybe go on the discussion later with some more arguments.
All right. Well, thanks, Florian. It was a bit unexpected because you had a couple of minutes left, but hey, I won't argue with you about it, and I'm quite sure others on the panel will be happy to make use of this 3 minutes. So, moving from legal norms to norms research, next in line is Max with a paper from him and Lisbeth Zimmermann. Max, please.
Thank you, Holger, and thank you all for the great presentation so far, and of course also many thanks for organizing this event. It's been great so far. Unfortunately, as Holger said, Lisbeth Zimmermann could not make it today, but she does send her best regards, so I hope I can fill in for her. Like the other papers, our papers addresses some of the normative dynamics that are or have been evolving internationally since the Russian invasion began. And in the paper, we say a few more words about how we situate the constructivist approach. And for those of you who were in the panel on realism before, I think there was already said a lot about it, and I will skip this part, I guess. So the question that we address in the paper so far, and we hope to expand this to other cases a little bit, is the question of how the Russian invasion and its justification are affecting the international peace and security architecture and its core norms. So to do so, the paper draws on debates about the robustness of international norms in constructivist norms research. And the central argument that we identify in this literature is that norm violations alone are not a sufficient indicator to assess the strength of international violations. So far so good, maybe straightforward, but I think it's important to reiterate this point. Of course, it is without doubt that the Russian invasion in scale and purpose constitutes a blatant violation of the prohibition on the use of force in Article 2.4, and also a violation of many other international human rights norms, humanitarian international law. The recent report of the UN fact-finding mission is on the situation in the Ukraine has provided, I think, ample evidence of these ongoing violations. So what to make of these violations, right? In the paper, at the moment, we kind of go back to rather early debates in IR norms research, understanding international norms as distinguishing between appropriate and inappropriate behavior, which implies that this oughtness does, at least to a certain degree, steer international actions, right? So not only the invasion itself, but also the Russian attempts to justifying it in the language of international law, as we just heard, sometimes challenging these norms in itself, right? We, of course, paint a rather meager picture of how international norms shape international politics. And yeah, not only in IR, also in international law, this has reinvigorated long-standing debates, especially about the so-called deaths, or rather by now the many deaths of Article 2.4, as Thomas Frank first coined it by now more than 50 years ago. And he was commenting on great power interventions, and this obituary has been regularly repeated as it has been rejected. The ongoing debate about the so-called 7 lives of Article 2.4 underline in a way then the pertinence of the question of how we can best ascertain the strengths or the robustness of international norms. So the starting point for us in the paper is Katopis and Draghi's writing in 1986, right? Often cited, as I said earlier, deserves repeating statement that norms are counterfactually valid, and that to understand norm violations, we need to, and I quote, analyze how the community assesses the violation and responds to it, right? And we already heard from Cornelia much about different ways how the international community, institutions, and so on and so forth can do that. And I should add, even domestically, of course, right, we see many norms violated without calling the respective norms automatically into question. So even though early constructivists then demonstrated that norms shape foreign policies decision, they also added that they would that it would be a mistake to understand norms as kind of dictating compliance, right? And I mean, by now, I think with two decades of contestational research, we have learned very much about how this compliance and what compliance actually means are always contested. So the what we take from that, right, is that we have to look at the validity and effectivity of norms at discourse and practice, as it were. And another crucial concept that we try to get back to in the paper is the tipping point at which norms have either gained or lost sufficient support in international society, which has been somewhat vaguely described at being located at a third of all states, including those, and I think this is of course important, critical for implementing these norms. So what does this tell us then about the norms of international peace and security law? After the 24th of February, I mean, I think it's fair to say that condemnation came from all over the world. Yet, and we heard this already from Florian as well, right? It's important that this condemnation has not been universal and still isn't. And given the unsurprising deadlock of the Security Council in the matter, there was no way of dealing with this issue in the prima facie competent UN organ, right? So the central decision at the United Nations would be, as you all know, the General Assembly resolution under the Uniting for Peace mechanism adopted on the 2nd of March, that, and I quote again, deplores in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine in violation of Article 2.4 of the Charter, end of quote. 141 states voted in favor, 35 abstained, and 5 voted against it. And 7 months later, the General Assembly, convening for yet another emergency session, came to a similar decision regarding the so-called referenda on the accession to Russia in Donetsk, Kherson, and Luhansk and Zaporizhia, with then a vote of 143 votes in favor, 5 against again, and 35 abstentions. So what does this mean? I mean, at first glance, we see a very strong commitment to the current peace and security architecture, at least among a large group of states. It is also worth noting, I think, that this group has grown since the resolution against Russia. in the aftermath of the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And it has been sustained throughout this year. I think some commentators were rather cautious whether that would be the case with the second vote a couple of weeks ago. At the same time, it is, however, I think also worth noting that at least the condemnation of the Russian invasion, even in the United Nations, is, as I already said, not universal. And whether this means then that there is not a universal commitment to the norms in question is, I think, another question, right? I mean, we heard this before. It would now depend on looking more closely at how states abstaining, voting against this justify their choice. Indeed, I think we would concur with Florian is that at least in the Russian statements for the other states like China, I'm not exactly sure that initially had. Then again, I mean, 141 or 143 votes sounds like a strong statement. But also going back to the debates about where this tipping point as a concept is located, it is also obvious that Russia is one of the veto powers that has obviously voted against the resolution, and with China a second veto power in the Security Council has abstained. And India, together with China, are making up for more than a third of the world's population. So if we look a bit about beyond the one state dynamic, we might come to a different conclusion as how far these norms are supported in international society. All right. So while the reactions to the Russian invasion have certainly reinforced the commitment among and within a large group of not only Western states, there's some ambiguity for the group of states abstaining from these resolutions. I think it would be difficult to say that we have reached indeed some kind of tipping point in changing the meaning or the robustness of these norms. But at least it's not as clear-cut as it has sometimes been formulated in the wake of these resolutions. Then the second question and also the second point in the presentation before I conclude would then be, of course, the question of why these states chose their position, right? And Florian already pointed to the logic of appropriateness and the logic of consequences, and that's what I want to come back to as well. I mean, from a constructivist perspective, we would, of course, expect that states follow these norms because they think that's the right thing to do and that there's some kind of normative pressure to do so. And indeed, looking at many statements made at the UN General Assembly and elsewhere, for example, by the German foreign minister and German diplomats, there are many ways of evidence of actions following the attempt, right, to doing the right thing, to bolstering these norms and so on and so forth. However, and I think that's interesting, the German statements, for example, link this line of argument also to a much more utilitarian reasoning, right? I quote again, today it is Ukraine, tomorrow it could be any of us. The sovereign equality and territorial integrity of any of us would be at the mercy of our neighbors. And this reference to the potentially dangerous neighbors is something that runs through several of the statements at the UN General Assembly, which might indicate that the logic of appropriateness is not the best explanation for this strong support for the norms. It would, of course, still raise the question of why these states think that that the normative architecture that we have is the best way to protect them, right? So to conclude, it is certainly too early to make a conclusion about the weakening or even erosion of the provision of the use of force. Although I think this is maybe an additional point that one should keep in mind, that the current war raises the question of this might be a particularly influential precedent for the future, right? I mean, think about the scale and purpose of the intervention. Yeah, as I said, this is a very first draft, and we use this mainly to sort of use the debates and the voting at the General Assembly as a seismograph of norm dynamics. And what we would like to look at in the future as well is, of course, the Russian contestation and its nature. Florian already said a few things about this. And then other aspect, I think, relevant for constructivist norm research would be how we think and maybe have to rethink a concept like socialization and learning that this research used to explain how we induce compliance, right? And the question would be if this is where and I have a hard time seeing this right now. Where would we start with such an analysis in the case of Russia to given the almost cynical use of international norms and law, right, to induce a process of socialization, learning, rhetorical entrapment, you name it. So I think this also for us in the paper, I think the biggest question, and maybe for norms research more broadly. So thank you very much. And then I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Max. And last but not least, Sasan presenting his co-authored work with Nietzsche.
Das versuchen
Ja, die kommt gleich.
Fantastisch.
Aha.
Ja, man muss nur drohen.
Genau, dann sind wir aber Teil. Alright.
Warte eben, das genau. Und dann genau. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction and the possibility to present our paper. Also, thanks to the organizers. It's wonderful to be sort of back at the alma mater, of course. So this paper is co-authored with my colleague Mitja Sienknecht, who can't be here today because she's on parental leave and does send her best regard though. So delivering weapons into an ongoing conflict as responsible behavior towards the responsibility support is what we have titled our paper very modestly, as you can see. So we begin our paper with the observation that we have a strong variation when it comes to state reactions to the Russian war against Ukraine, right? So we have variation on the level whether states support Ukraine or not, but that's sort of very tilted because we just heard most of them do support Ukraine in one way or the other. But more interestingly for us, we have a strong variation in the way in which states support or choose to support Ukraine, from voting in favor of resolutions condemning the Russian aggression, to financial aid, to the seizing of assets of Russian oligarchs, all the way to delivery of weapons. Looking at relevant norms governing the use of force and the right to self-defense, there's really not a clear legal obligation for such a support that goes beyond diplomatic support, right? We don't have the normative or we don't have norms that basically ask states that it's appropriate to deliver weapons. They may choose to for various value-based or moral reasons, but looking at the norms at hand, that's not very obvious to explain this. There's no obvious answer to explain such behavior. So based on these observations, we raise several questions in the paper. There's two I want to focus on in my talk to stay within the time limit. So the first one is, how can we conceptualize and understand the different behavior of states in the Russian war against Ukraine? And relatedly, and given that this is a norms panel as well, how does this behavior impact the development of relevant norms? To answer both of these questions and other questions we have in the paper, we use a topology Mitja Sienknecht and I have developed elsewhere that we argue allows us to categorize norm, what we call norm-related behavior, so linking specific types of behavior to individual or set of norms. So let me briefly discuss or explain the four types of behavior, and it's really fitting that Max just talked about appropriate and inappropriate behavior, because this is where our typology starts sort of with a well-known norms literature, which in this room certainly does not need to be outlined in detail. So in line with existing norms research, we basically understand appropriate behavior as norm-compliant behavior of actors. And inappropriate behavior then includes cases of norm violation, cases of norm compliance, and something called norm underfulfillment, that is, states generally adhere to a norm, but when it comes to the implementation, they don't really reach the full behavioral request. A very easy case to see this is the idea that a state should spend a certain percentage of the GDP on developmental aid. So they do that, but they stay underneath the generally agreed threshold of 0.7 of the GDP, or think about the 2% NATO defensive goal, right? So you adhere to the norm, but you're really not fully fulfilling that 10%. So we would call that inappropriate behavior. But on the right side of our typology, we have responsible behavior, and that's basically when actors go beyond or above what is regarded as appropriate. And we identify three configurations of responsible behavior, sort of for first sort of overfulfillment. Again, the easy example is basically giving more in terms of developmental aid, for example, than states have generally agreed on as a threshold. Second, if actors not strictly bound by a specific treaty, basically self-declare that they will now follow a specific norm. So think here about armed non-state actors who put out declarations saying, okay, you know what, we also follow, say, the norm of environmental protection, armed conflicts, even though the specific treaties are between states and we actually don't have anything to do with this. Or think about the recent case of an NGO that started to collect money to buy armored vehicles for the Ukrainian army, right? This is usually not the kind of actor we would expect this behavior to, but they choose still to sort of overfulfill existing norms. And the third situation is when actors do not relate their behavior to a specific norm, but rather provide normative or moral reasons. And that behavior, we argue in the paper in more detail, can actually be norm generative. And finally, we talk of irresponsible behavior when actors do not act in a situation of moral obligation, although they may have the means to change an under situation. And an example here in the case would be India. So, and we developed this against the background of norms research and responsibility research within IR theory. Sorry. So we then, in the paper, in some more detail than I will be able to do this now here, apply the typology to the various response states have displayed. So as I already said, what would be appropriate behavior? It would be the case of diplomatic support through voting in favor of resolutions supporting Ukraine, right? You do the right thing, but you don't go really beyond what is being asked here. Responsible behavior, and I'll return to this now because in a moment, because I know it will at least irritate some. Responsible behavior is anything from financial support to the delivery of weapons to Ukraine. Inappropriate behavior in this case then would be the support of Russia as the aggressor, including weapons delivery. So think of Iran here. And irresponsible behavior in this typology would include taking up a neutral position, although the state would be able to do something that is would sort of prevent further aggression, further suffering, and so on. So in the paper, we then provide a more detailed discussion of this application and go into more detail regarding the three configurations of responsible behavior. And we specifically look at Germany and its decision to deliver weapons. And what we also try to show here is that the decision to deliver weapons and go beyond what existing norms asked in cases of when the state defends itself against an armed attack is that the decision to strongly support Ukraine with not only money, but also with weapons may herald the emergence of what could be called a responsibility to support in such situations of self-defense. So for the remainder of the presentation, I want to do two things. First of all, I want to present three important, in our view, at least important normative caveats about our claim that delivery of weapons into an ongoing conflict can be called responsible behavior. And I want to talk a little bit about the feasibility and usefulness of our typology, not just for this case, but also potentially for other cases. So no doubt, we make a strong normative claim in the paper. Delivering weapons into an ongoing conflict is responsible behavior. It's sort of basically the right thing to do. And that, of course, has been debated in German politics, within the IR community at large. And we are very much aware of the strengths of this claim and the irritation it may cause, at least in some circles. And we are happy to debate this, of course. But we do want to introduce some, in our view, important normative caveats to the claim, so to not understand. We do not generally hold the position that weapons exports in general are conducive to peace. We use our topology in this case to analyze the empirical reality that states have delivered weapons and use the topology to typologize and understand that behavior. So conceptualization that weapons deliveries can be responsible behavior should not be used as an argument for any future policy decision. And second, and this is related, we caution against applying our claim to all kinds of weapon deliveries. Put differently, context matters. Who delivers what kind of weapons into which conflict will ultimately be decisive for assessing whether it's responsible behavior or not. And third, and this is sort of moving a little bit away from the weapons debate, we have not discussed why Ukraine gets such massive support, while other equally brutal and much longer lasting conflicts do not. And that, of course, is a very different but equally important debate. So let me conclude. What does our topology allow us to do? We argue it allows us to do four things. First, systematically study variation in state behavior. While we only illustrate one potential application in the paper, we believe our topology can be applied to a variety of state behaviors and potentially the behavior of other actors in other contexts. The topology is open to change and dynamics. Notably, states can move from one type of behavior to another. Germany's decision very quickly to decide to deliver weapons is a clear example of such a change from what we would call appropriate to responsible behavior. Our topology is thus open to norm dynamics and norm change, or behavioral change for that matter. We can also use the topology to relate state behavior to existing or emerging norms. Studying closely the justifications for state behaviors, we can connect these justifications to existing or potentially emerging norms. As I outlined before, the decision by many states to deliver weapons to a state defending itself under the right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter may signal the emergence of a responsibility to support norm. And finally, through connecting state behavior and the norms actors draw on when justifying their specific behavior, we are able to provide a normative assessment of state behavior. And with that, I end. I thank you for your attention, and my co-author Mitya and I look very much forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sasan. Once more, a very on-time presentation. And now we have comments by Antje Wiener. Antje,
okay,
please.
well, thank you very much. I'll be fairly brief. I want to make these comments under the assumption that norm research, what's the value of norms research? I'll be, I don't know, maybe very critical towards our own work. I think in order to be valuable to IR and to society, in a norm research needs to be able to say something about order and the change of order. And I'll just flag two themes here for these papers. And then I go into the papers and basically highlight a few major points. And then I want to raise some questions with regard to where this might lead. When we talk about contestation, we opened the conference with the reference to that we might be at the Zeitenwende might also mean critical juncture. And so this might be a consequence of deep contestation. And that, of course, makes sense if we know about which order we are talking about. And so then my questions against which I read the papers were, one is, how do these papers speak to norms research as a field? Can we see the field through the papers? So what are the definition of norms? What are norms in relation to practice? What do we learn about norms as carriers of meaning? What are substantive aspects of the normative structure of meaning and use that we are looking at beyond the formal order? And then a second theme complex, I think, that these papers helpfully would address or should address is the question of Zeitenwende and what follows from that. And for that, they need to say something about the critical juncture. Is this a critical juncture or not? Do they have the tools to actually, help study that with regard to the order that they're looking at? And here we look at the negotiation of treaties as norms that are there on international law, but also at ground rules. What are the ground rules of a particular type of order? And we are looking at the societal impact versus the law that's out there. With that, I move to the first paper that follows actually quite nicely, the Baciu paper. That's all about aggression, norm violation, but also in a very careful way points to the treaties and the norms that are there. So it's very helpful to draw the context. But the paper, I think, shows a puzzlement about how law and society hang together. And it sometimes speaks about law as a practice. And then the next thing is that you talk about norms as a practice. And that stretches norms research very far. So I think that this, if you could say something about that and clarify that, that might be helpful, because the paper is really very well detailed and it's well-written paper. So the second paper, Hubert, I think is a core paper here in this group, because Florian, you observe what I think is really important. You observe different orders, and somehow in the paper, you raise the question: are we actually aware of these different orders? Are we aware of the qualities of these very different orders, and that maybe, therefore, in different orders, different logics are at work? And so, with your reference to, I think that's a methodological part. How do we actually observe a norm? How do we know a norm? And how does one order relate to another? And that's very nicely, so the question of the connectivity of a multiplicity of orders that might be out there. And I thought, I mean, I highly recommend reading the paper, but my question to you, can you also say it in English? And you did for the presentation, but the paper is I think for non-German speakers, it's very difficult to read. But the sort of the multiple orders there. Then the Lesch and Zimmermann, well, what can I say? It's not really surprising that you talk about norm robustness and you do very careful and very clear, sort of you are conceptually very clear. But if we agree that there are various orders and that these orders are devised from different cultural backgrounds and a multiplicity of agents are at work, maybe also across the boundaries of these orders, is it really helpful to focus on specific logics of action? That is really something that, and I think the paper brings that to bear, that we need to deal with it. I mean, we all work with these logics all the time. I would probably say, well, you could also replace the logic of action and say, well, I look at the principle of contestedness and then see what kind of logics evolve around that. And that might lead you sort of further into behavioral research and questions of identity. But the leading question, I think, would be, can norms be robust across different orders? So that's a question that I think you want to look at. And you will need that in order to think about a tipping point. And then the Goriaga and Zienknecht paper, I think it's the idea that the responsibility to support is great, to break that open. But again, the question is here, leading questions for your norm-related behavior is, who sets the standards and where are the standards set? Again, I think probably Florian and also Gunther's work and also Jason Ralph to go more into a sort of a pragmatist even more, and I know that you've done the abductive work, Maybe you could combine also your previous own research on the humanization of international relations and international law in order to take a more of a bottom-up perspective. Now, the final bit where I wanted to flag a few points, if we think of deep contestation, that's if we deep contestation of a particular order, and if we interpret that as addressing the ground rules of an order, we need to make a choice. Which order matters most to us? And I think that's really something that could invite a discussion. Of course, in the group that I've been working with, we looked at the deep contestation of the LEO, the Liberal International Order, and I can stand by that because, you know, I can define this as a Western Northern academic. I actually do like these values, and I can make the case for these values. And perhaps I want to save that order, but not everybody will like that order. So we get into a situation where we start talking about what is kind of the underbelly, what is constitutive for distinct types of orders. And there, of course, we are back to norms. And norms, as soft institutions and formal institutions, are constitutive of certain types of orders. And then we can, I think there's two tasks, and I finish with that. One is to identify the orders that matter globally. Two, the question, which order do I wish to defend? And finally, to come back to the deep contestation and the effect, what of contestation is constructive and what is destructive? I've finished there. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Antje, for these comments, both on the papers, but also more general. I think I should also say thank you very much for a very personal normative message by a norms researcher, which is, I think, a very interesting point. And we are good on time. I'm wondering myself what I could have messaged to my panel that they were all so much on time. So I hope I didn't scare you too much, but we are good on time. And nevertheless, I'd like to open the floor for some additional comments and questions before we have a round of responses, a first round of responses from the audience. And since I already see a couple of hands, I'd say we make two rounds. So why don't we start with the first ones, that is Bernhard Stahl. No, let's take it first row and second row. Okay, so Bernhard Stahl, Alex Treff, Elvira Rosat first, then a quick round of responses, and then the second row has its chance. All right. Who does it say? Bernhard Stahl, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your inspiring presentations. I have one question to Cornelia, one to Florian, and one to Saswan. One to Cornelia. Punishment. Is that, or was the idea of punishment in a way inspired by the behavior of an empire? Because it's an imperial war in Ukraine, as some say, and an empire is always in a kind of patronizing mode, trying to discipline in a way the protectorates or the enemies. And so punishment would be a typical feature of an empire, in a way, yeah, safeguarding order for the empire. And my second related question is, if punishment goes together with legality, let's say the Afghanistan war, so there wouldn't be any tension then? So if the Security Council is in a way rewarding punishment. My question to Florian, I was wondering, you said, okay, Russia would like to make sure that Russianhood is safeguarded in Ukraine. Do you see any reliance to cultural genocide and this kind of emerging discussion among the responsibility to protect? Because this is an argument cultural genocide researchers usually bring forward. And Sasan, appropriate and responsible behavior. I was a little bit struck by your modesty regarding the United Nations Charter, because my reading is much more ambitious. Since the Korean War and the Second Gulf War, I said, okay, in case of an invasion, all countries are called to send troops and in a way to liberate Kuwait or South Korea or whatever, and not only to send weapons or to give some warm words, but really to make sure, okay, we defend this country against the aggressor. Imagine each of the 140 countries would do that, Russian invasion would be over in due course. So where does your modesty come from?
Okay, thanks, Manager. Alex.
Thanks. I have two questions, one for Florian and one for Sasan. I start with Florian. If I understood you right, you make the argument that the war in Ukraine fundamentally changes something, well, in our perspectives on how Russia, looks at norms. And I was wondering whether this is actually true. I mean, if I recall the Georgian case in 2008, then even back then, the argument was on a rhetorical level by Lavrov that, of course, Russia is here implementing R2P, and he said, these are our people, right, etc. But then on the official level of the United Nations, Russia went to the United Nations and actually officially referred to Article 51 and said, this is our general justification for that. And so I was wondering whether the case we look at right now is actually changing something fundamentally in Russian behavior. And here's an idea I was thinking about, that when you look at the Russian way of looking at international law, then it seems to me there's kind of a regional versus a global perspective. That is to say, in what used to be called the post-Soviet space, Russia is very much undermining even its own traditional notion of international law, as we see right now most directly. But on a global scale, where the interests are not touched so directly in national interests, they refer to international law and its traditional understanding of the post-45 world. And the question for Sasan, you put out this typology. I was wondering, when you take this typology seriously and you want to apply it to other cases, and you mentioned context is very important, right? It matters. My question is, how does it matter? Here's my provocation. Should have Germany supported and armed Iraq against the United States? If not, why not?
All right, thanks. Maybe Rosa, please.
Thank you very much for the interesting and inspiring panel. I have two comments for two papers, Max and Lisbeth and Sasan's and Niemann. And I'll start with Max's paper. So I very much agree with your diagnosis that the norm hasn't been substantially weakened by this war, even though some commentators at the beginning very easily shouted that out. But I think using systematic indicators as we have developed them for normal erosion, it doesn't materialize. So I think you are right here. I was just wondering whether you have also looked at justifications for non-condemnation. Because you mentioned as one indicator justifications for violation or not violation, and the other indicator was reactions. And then in your empirical examples, you only referred to how countries justify that they are condemning. So maybe it's also worthwhile to look at the reasons, if any, given for non-condemnation, because if there aren't any, you could also say something about this trend. So you could also gain an indicator. Satan's and Mitya's paper, also super interesting here. And I was just wondering, why did you merge the normative and the policy aspect and the analytic aspect into one paper? Because to me, it's two completely different arguments. And from a norm researcher's, from a norm researcher's perspective, I'm not sure we are the best people equipped to make normative arguments in that case. So maybe you and Mitya are, but at least not from the literature. But where we are strong, I think, is in analyzing a norm that is emerging. And here, I think you are spot on. to say that we see a new interpretation of the responsibility to protect. And it's super interesting because responsibility to protect has those three dimensions. The government is supposed to protect its citizens, and if the government isn't willing or able, then the international community is supposed to protect. And here we have the interesting case that you have a government that is willing to protect their citizens, but not able to. And that's how the responsibility to support has come into discourse. And I think that's a way of thinking about it that I haven't yet. So thanks for that. That's where I would go with that paper. I think it enriches the debate. And here I think you would do just good with providing an empirical analysis, and then you can just show that this has emerged in the discourse. And it's interesting and puzzling because it runs counter the norms that have been valid and up to now. So that's the analytical argument. Yes, and as to a normative and the policy argument, I was reminded a little bit of the Kosovo debate, where I'm not sure about the English term, but in German it was Recht auf Nothilfe, no? That some people might mobilize. So maybe that would be one direction to gain the normative basis. But I would not make it.
Thanks, Idea. So this would be our first round of questions, and I'd like you to ask to respond to both Antje's comments as well as some of the questions from the audience, and we'll start with Cornelia once again.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much, Antje, for engaging with our paper and for your careful read. Very good comments, thanks. And yeah, so if I understood your question correctly, how we distinguish between law and norms, and I think that's a that's a tough question. I mean, if we think of law, I see I see, for example, one possibility to define law is to look into the sources of international law, so treaty-based law, customary law, and so on. But then there is also some overlap with norms, because we also have, in terms of norms, peremptory norms, so we could also see them as a form of customary law. We also have some soft norms, and this is where there might be some gray zone and not really, it might be challenging to delineate what are soft norms, what are hard norms. There are also conventions in international law that have been established that are not peremptory norms, that are also not customary law, such, for example, the nuclear taboo. So the idea that nuclear weapons should not be used is not something that is prohibited per se, but it's something that has been conventionally established that there is an established taboo that nuclear weapons should not be used. And that's, it's again, somewhere, it's not a clear treaty law, but it's not a clear customary law. It was more kind of a convention. But I think what's the most important is that law and norms, they, as you're saying, that they give meaning to the order, and also this has to do a lot with ontological security of states. And I think this is where international organization as such, as an organ of implementing law, of implementing norms, is important, because if we look at the security architecture or normative architecture, legal architecture that has been established after the end of the Second World War, we have the sense of stability, because the international organization and international organizations as such being able to keep this upright balance can be interpreted as giving the states a sense of ontological security, because they feel ontological secure. They do not fear instability, but this is now not the case anymore in the context of contestation and in states feeling ontologically unsecure. And now to your question, Martin, in the relation between legality and punishment, and whether they stay in tension. Well, I think they do, yeah. So because what is legality is different to, this is also the argument that I'm trying to make in my paper, that we have this tension between legality as an objective mode of authority and legality as a social practice, because legality depends also on practices of recognition and non-recognition. And while we perceive a norm violation in Ukraine, and which is actually quite clear, for Russia it is not, because and this is what I'm trying to explain with this idea of changing imaginaries, that is just it is actually quite linked to what you have mentioned, the idea of empire and the post-colonial moment, and that kind of remembrance of the past that is contributing to this changing imaginaries in this case. And I wanted to say something more on punishment, but maybe shortly to imaginaries, why they are so important. They are so important because they determine the dynamics of recognition and non-recognition of norms, but also because they establish the moral standards and how the states are seeing what is moral valid and what is not. So this is why they are so important. Thank you.
Thanks. There's also another second round, so still some room for responding to questions. Florian, next, please.
I will answer to both questions, actually. My point was not so much that Russia really copy or even mock the idea of R2P in their current actions in Ukraine. And Russia still, and even after Ukraine, will not accept any idea of humanitarian intervention or something else, and will certainly not accept any intervention beyond its own, what they call near abroad. The point was rather that Russia invents in some way an own idea of how and when intervention makes sense in the first place, and are in legitimate action that are to be performed under even international law. And second, it is important to be aware that Russia is actually providing a new legal logic, so to say, which can be understood, and if so, makes it possible for us to distinguish between what actually are meaningful actions for Russia, not for us, but for Russia itself, and which is not. And it's quite important, for example, I guess, that Russia seems to have little problems for example, Finland joining NATO, in contrast to Ukrainian having some orientation to Western politicians or something. So there are some preconditions we firstly have to reconstruct from the Russian thinking, which allows us to reconstruct the whole logic on how Russian reasonings and actions works, and what makes sense for Russia and which not. And I think, and maybe also answering to Antje in some degree, for that we need to deepen actually our conception of norms, which are not just objects or institutions to be applied, but whether they build the very backdrop from which we differentiate between meaningful and senseless actions, or between meaningful and appropriate and violation actions. So the very idea of norms, it's very deeper than we usually handle it in traditional norm research. And then it's certainly not enough to just detect that Russia is violating norms and standards, or mocking them, or whatsoever, be they legal or social norms, but we need to really reconstruct how these rationalities within one order, as Antje calls it, works, and give reasons for these states as one backdrop from which the choosing between rational action and so on takes place, and try to reconstruct the reasons for very specific actions, such as invading Ukraine or claiming historic rights to be valued. So in general, my major point would rather be that we really need to address and need to force ourselves to really reconstruct the logic of Russia and these whole state groups around Russia and China, and how they think and act, and why this makes sense to them to perform such kind of actions. And this is certainly not an easy task, as we are always part of one order, so to say. And we see, it seems, I mean, in the end, it seems, for us, it seems absolutely inappropriate and senseless what Russia is doing in the first place. There's no rational answer to explain why is Russia invading Ukraine from a Western or liberal perspective. It simply does not make sense. But the point is that for Russia, it does make sense. And we need to reconstruct why it does make sense for Russia to act in these ways, and to kind of react, to reconstruct these logics and rationalities they perform.
All right. Well, thanks, Florian. Max, next, please.
Yeah, thank you, Antje, for your comments. And I mean, I think with regard to the general comments, I think you're quite right, at least with regard to our paper, that it's important to clarify where the starting point of the analysis is in terms of the order and the norms that we are looking at. I mean, in terms of the multiplicity of orders, I mean, in a way, I hinted to this with these different voting groups, right? That would be more or less spatial, or I don't know, country-based approach. But you could also think of it, and I think it's important also for maybe for Florian's paper, to think of it in terms of sociology of profession or field perspective, right? I mean, if you think of Anthea Roberts' work, she would locate the way Russia makes its reasoning in international law in the way it is taught in Russia, right? And similarly in the United States, where surprisingly it's not really taught as an international discipline. Then one might also get to different logic of action, right? That was your second point, and you're obviously right that they are a bit old-fashioned, right? And we are certainly developed that further. But I think that, yeah, I think that looking at different levels probably would need us to think about different logic of action, right? In a legal perspective, you make different arguments. Then on a societal level, then there is, I think, where Sassan's arguments are coming in. And then there's the question, is there a basal order, right? I mean, Tom Ginsburg in his work on authoritarian international law, I think he would argue that there is still the bottom line that there is sovereignty and non-intervention, and that on these liberal and authoritarian states could agree on. I mean, it comes with a certain problem, this argument with regard to the Russian intervention, of course, but this could then be the starting point for having at something very, very minimal. Then Ellie, yeah, important point, of course, well taken. We haven't done the systematic research yet. I mean, it comes a bit back, I think, to the thing about the minimal agreement that I just mentioned. I think if you would look at the statements by China, it starts with a strong commitment to the norm in question, right? And then it says something like, well, but we have to cherish the peace process and we don't want to yeah. This, I think this would then be one explanation, and one pattern that you could see it at the United Nations. You might probably also see countries that just categorically don't vote for country-specific resolutions, right? And so also not to set a precedent for the future. So I don't know if that played out in the Uniting for Peace debates as well, but those were the things I would look at, and then it is of course necessary to have the complete picture. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Max. And Sassan.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'll begin with Antje's points. Thank you very much for that. You're absolutely right? We sort of in that paper, we not really open about, or not really discuss the question where these standards come from. For the moment, for the analysis, what we do is sort of, we take the United Nations Charter as given, as at the order we, I think, would also prefer to defend if it comes to that, right? That would be our normative position in that case. But I think the bottom-up perspective is interesting. And I mean, one way of doing this, and this of course relates to your own work as well, is, well, who's affected by the actions? And shouldn't those who are affected by the immediate actions be the ones whose interpretation of the relevant norms matter in a way, and then that would be, of course, the country that's being attacked. So Ukraine should have a say in how they would like the norm of self-defense being sort of understood and read by the international community, right? So that would be certainly one way of doing that. But I think the idea of multiplicity and multiple orders, and I mean, one way of using that topology would be, of course, basically to use this as an empirical lens and go basically and look at different things and see where different actors would place their own behavior and their justifications in that topology, and that would potentially allow you basically to map sort of clusters of behavior and sort of reconstruct different multiplicity of orders from there, but that's definitely more than one paper. So very quickly on the questions from the audience, thank you very much, I think that this is an interesting one, right? Because in my understanding, the delivery of weapons falls short of the use of force, and hence does not require UN Security Council authorization, but hence also would not, is sort of allowed at a level underneath sort of the use of force debate, right? It doesn't fall in the question of use of force, which is like Kosovo and Iraq fell under, right, Chapter 7, but the relevant norm is self-defense. So the argument here would be the delivery of weapons doesn't happen under sort of the prohibition of the use of force and whether that's allowed or not debate, but it happens under how do actors understand the right of self-defense. And I think my reading of Iraq, Kuwait, and also were about the human rights violations taking place. And that was the important relevance for actually intervening at the end of the day. Here, the point was more like, okay, the self-defense issue, but of course, the long conflict goes on, the more these two merges, because now we have the human rights violations, we have the potential genocide. So of course, this makes things more complex. So the modesty is basically very sort of a narrow reading for the moment of the UN Charter, but of course there are other readings, and then you come to different conclusions. Germany should have supported Iraq in 2003. Thank you for that. No, because I think and I think there could be agreement on this in the room, the very decisive difference is that Iraq wasn't a democracy in 2003 and you had an authoritarian leader, and I think it would be, but I think what you could argue is that not supporting the US in an illegal war could be understood as the responsible thing to do for Germany. It was the right thing to do not to go with the US into the war. Ellie, very briefly, I disagree that we are bad at normative. Making normative analysis or more normative? Well, yeah, okay. So yeah, these are multiple papers if you split out all of this, but yes, I would say there's good reasons to do that, both the empirical analysis and the normative claim, and I think in some cases it's even necessary to do them together, but the paper sort of tries to make an illustration of a typology, and of course, that's a spatial issue here, of course. Okay, I'll stop. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. So we have a second round of questions and comments, which has to be a quicker one, both in terms of asking questions and in terms of responding to questions. And we also have a question from the virtual audience. I'd like to start with that one, and then go as promised to the second row here. And
if we have time.
Yeah, well, just put that into your comment and abuse your comment for a question. I sometimes do that as well. So who is in for a question from the second row? It's 1, 2. All right. So we do have 2 questions, and then we'll see how it goes. And Raji, please go ahead.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for your very rich talk, and then for the organizers for making this a hybrid event. So I have a question to Sassan's and Mitchell's paper, and I'm very interested in learning more about your framework and reading more about it. And my question is that, how does your model capture a behavior that may result in conflicting responsibility that generate both responsible and irresponsible behavior? And here I'm thinking about hypothetical example here. Okay, so on the one hand, it may be responsible to send weapons to Ukraine, but then on the other hand, it could be, for example, if that country is really poor, it doesn't have money to buy weapons, or it needs more defense system, then it would be irresponsible to the domestic constituents. to send weapons to Ukraine. So I'm just curious, how does your model kind of capture this? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Please.
Thank you. Jonas Rieke from Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. Just shortly, one comment shortly to Florian. I would strongly second what Alexander said and would maybe advise to drop the term near abroad. To the best of my knowledge, this hasn't been part of Russian high politics discourse for quite a while, and that might be a needless thing that reviewers might stumble upon. Then, just to clarify, Stefan, did you code German behavior, normative behavior before the Zeitenwende towards Ukrainian aid as appropriate, and then after that as responsible, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not a law researcher, but I did work on the on security cooperation towards Ukraine before the Zeitenwende, and I can't wrap my head around this, because if we look at the global Northwest, the pressure that was put on Germany and the shaming that went on, this is, and it was a normative undertone, because they were saying you are cozying up with a potential aggressor amidst a war threat, and you are neglecting and using pacifist discourse to not help a clear victim. And it was a mechanism of appropriateness, inappropriateness, and either this pressure was put upon Germany by Ukraine and a lot of important discursive actors, or the others remained silent on the issue. So is this not just inappropriate if you go outside of the German conversation, the German language itself? Frankly, not many other actors. And then can you, following, isn't that begrudgingly appropriate and not quote unquote proactively responsible, because that's what I'm associating with it. I might have gotten everything wrong here, but I had a very strong reaction towards this, and you might face this from other scholars as well.
All right, thanks, Jonas. So if there are no further questions, I have a billion of questions to you, but I'll just stick to one observation. I find it quite interesting that most of our talk today was about legal norms and state behavior, which are, of course, important parts, but not often the usual parts of norms research, right? So I really would like to wonder also about punishment in terms of social norms or societal behavior and stuff like that. But we have a quick round of responses from the panel, and maybe also from Antje, if you would like. And Sasan, is that too unfair to start with you? So just we go back in backwards order?
No, that's fine.
So we'll start with Sasan and then go backwards and end up with Antje.
So weapons delivered by poor country, right? So our notion of the understanding of responsibility we have in the paper is deeply rooted in sort of the more recent responsibility literature, and that of course also is connected to the notion of capability. So if a state isn't capable of doing something, that it would normatively like to support a country with weapons, but if it doesn't have the capacity to do so, we wouldn't code this as irresponsible or whatever, because of course responsibility does entail the question of are you actually capable of doing that, and it becomes sort of irresponsible if you are capable of doing it but decide not to do that. The question about German weapons delivery. So what interests us now in a way is, of course, what we did, we looked at the justifications of the states, right? How they justified their behavior. And of course, you could make the point that it was irresponsibly of Germany or even inappropriate not to support Ukraine more in hindsight, right? That I would, yeah, that might be the case. But what we observe here is that until 3 days after the war, the German position across government coalitions, it's actually Mingo, I think, from the 1970s, is we do not deliver weapons into ongoing conflicts, full stop, whatever the decision, whatever the circumstances are. And that is what changed within 3 days. And this is what we find fascinating, that there's a whole debate going on whether Germany should have acted differently and whether sort of the support for Nord Stream 2, for example, was inappropriate. That wasn't our case. What we look at in the paper is the decision to switch from we don't deliver weapons, we find this inappropriate to do into ongoing conflict situations, to it's the right thing to do to deliver weapons into an ongoing conflict situation in that specific case. And that's a shift that is of interest to us here. But yeah, I think we can talk more later after that, because you are still irritated by that.
All right, well, we'll see how it goes. Max, please. Oh, no. Yeah, Max, please, go ahead.
I think there were no questions. I maybe have just a comment. I think that the focus on legal norms is rather reflective of the whole field of norms research. Wouldn't you think? I think.
Yeah, it was something about the expectation. Maybe we also have a discussion after the panel. All right, Florian, any final comments from you? No?
I mean, I have nothing more to add. Actually, I would like to hear some more reasons why I should drop the very term near abroad, but we can do it bilateral. I mean, some other conditions.
All right, I think that goes smooth. Cornelia.
Yes, thank you so much. So I'd like to use my space to make 2 points. One is this comment that I had on your paper, which I thought is fascinating, and I couldn't obtain to make a parallel to a publication that my Center for Military Studies at Department of Political Science has recently published. It's a publication called Afterfilm, which means after peace. And this report is basically for the Danish government to assess, or it was for the Danish government to assess the legality of sending weapons to Ukraine. It was a publication that was released in the right after the invasion. So yeah, I could send it to you, and because there is a chapter on exactly this, how to assess the legality of sending weapons to Ukraine. And I'm wondering in your paper, how you assess, from which perspective you assess the different types of behavior. Is it from a moral perspective, from a human security perspective, is from a legal perspective? I mean, perhaps I should engage once again, and I should read once again your paper, maybe you mentioned this. But I wonder if it's from a legal perspective, then I miss the reference object, in the sense of I think you could refer to different legal systems. You mentioned jus ad bellum, but I think there are other reference legal systems such as international criminal law, to which you should make a reference, and also to customary law such as neutrality. So I think jus ad bellum and international criminal law are unproblematic from this perspective, but yeah, and then the neutrality can be argued as well, again, yeah, because it helps Ukraine self-defense. And yeah, that's it.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but we are over time already, although we did so good on time. And Discussant has already a lot to do after the panel. Antje is fine as well. So then, where are you? I mean, please go ahead if you have some final observations or comments. I mean,
I would say the same that I said, I think already twice. I think by looking at a particular norm, we should not lose sight of the context. And I would like to stress the constitutive role of norms and different types of norms. And norms have a state-building quality and an order-building quality, and they are moved towards that direction. And if we focus too much on the robustness of the behavior around one particular norm and lose sight of the context, what is the gain with regard to political order?
All right. Well, I think that's a nice way to conclude the panel. Thanks so very much for the panel, but also thanks so very much to you in the audience, both virtual and in-house. Do reach out to each other for continuing the conversation. I think there's plenty to talk. And other than that, it's a wrap. Thanks.